Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for checking out our documentary shorts competition program and for sticking around for the Q&A. I'm very excited to welcome our wonderful filmmakers here with us. So please join me in saying hello to Jesse Orit, the director of Feed the Bears. Kate Novak, director of Hysterica Girl.
Hey.
Julia Jant, director of My Father the Mover.
Hello.
And Lydia Cornett, director of Eves and Variation. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and for sharing your films with us. I want to get started. I love all of these films so much, and I was so drawn to all of the subjects that you chose to make a movie about. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what drew you to these people, these topics, and what it was that made you want to make a film about them. So Jesse, let's start with you and Feed the Bears.
Yeah, this is actually the first festival that this film has been at, so it's the virtual world premiere, so it's very exciting for me. And yeah, I heard a podcast on NPR, the Invisibilia podcast, a few years ago, and on that podcast, they went to the North American the Wildlife Research Center in northern Minnesota and filmed with these bears and interviewed some of the people in my film, and just listening to that podcast, I felt, compelled to go. Like I felt like I needed to be there in person and see this because it was just so wild to me. They were explaining hand feeding bears on this podcast, and I was just envisioning it in my mind, and I was like, there needs to be a documentary about this because it's almost unbelievable. So yeah, I was really interested just in how this place could exist. I had never interacted with a bear in person other than the zoo, and you hear these stereotypes and have this perception that they're these wild animals that are potentially dangerous and can be aggressive, and everything that these people were saying was that they're actually really gentle and they'll eat nuts out of your hand. So yeah, I was just really fascinated by that and wanted to sort of see it for myself and explore what this world where humans and bears peacefully cohabitate looks like. And, part of it also was, it was something that a lot of people didn't think was really okay. A lot of people don't think that people should be hand feeding bears. So that was another reason why I was interested in this story, was sort of exploring that in the film and then letting the viewer then sort of decide for themselves after seeing how these bears actually are up close and personal.
We got to see a brief snippet of you when a bear kind of walks by you. Was it just a totally terrifying moment the first time you got to see one up close and personal?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily terrifying for me. I would describe it more as surreal. It was like I almost had to pinch myself while we were shooting on a daily basis, because there'd be moments I would look around and you'd just be surrounded by like 4 or 5 huge bears. We spent a week there filming, and I would say by the end of it, I had sort of gotten used to it. And the moment in the film when the bear comes up to me, we had already been there for a few days. So I was actually somewhat used to it, but it was still very jarring and a little bit scary, I would say, even, in that environment. After being around them, they are wild animals, they're unpredictable. And I had certainly never been that close to a bear beforehand. But yeah, I mean, that I guess was one of my main interests too in making this film is I wanted to try to bring that real life experience to the viewer. So I wanted to, them to feel like what I felt in that moment, being, literally inches from a giant bear that could kill you.
Very casual.
Yeah. It was a very surreal, would probably be the best way to describe it, experience.
I can only imagine. And then Kate with Hysterical Girl, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you kind of dove into Freud and his first documented female case study and creating Dora and the vision that you had for this movie.
Yeah, well, I had wanted to do a film about Freud for a really long time, and the idea actually sort of originated in my own therapy. And it was sort of an idea growing in my head over 10, 15 years. And so I started going back and looking at some of, I mean, his body of work is huge, but I started, rereading some of what I had maybe read in college. And one of those cases was the Dora case, which is the, only case history that he produced of a female patient. And it's just this very infuriating way that he sort of, shifts the blame onto this teenaged girl for a sexual assault. And while I was doing my research, the Kavanaugh hearings were happening. And in those hearings, I didn't know yet that I was going to do the movie about the Dora case, but in those hearings, the sort of narrative and the language that was used to question Christine Blasey Ford or, to question Kavanaugh, it was so eerily familiar to what I had read in this Dora case. And so I really actually shifted from it being a feature to being a short kind of in that moment, and to try to use the case history as sort of a window into these Victorian theories that have endured in ways that are so pervasive that they're invisible. And they've endured in ways that have really enabled this sort of like systemic patriarchy to exist. And so that's sort of how it all started. If you hear a baritone in the background, I'm so sorry. There's someone in my house who happens to have that class right now. So yes.
Oh, good. All right, well, thank you. And then with Julia, My Father the Mover, can you talk a little bit about finding your subject, Stowan, and his dance group, and just how you decided to make a film about this beautiful art form?
Yeah, I was actually, I was looking to do a music video. I hadn't planned to make My Father the Mover at all. I was looking to do a music video, and I was looking for a dancer. And someone in my production team, when I said, "Do you know of a dancer?" He said, "Well, I know of this guy, he's a choreographer. He does kind of behind the scenes stuff. Maybe he'll know." So we had a meeting, and I sat down with him with this music video in mind. And I said, "So, how long have you been a dancer for?" And he interrupted me, and he said, "I'm not a dancer, I'm a mover." So I said, "Okay, tell me more." And he proceeded to tell me how he calls himself a mover because, yes, his day job, he choreographs, but what his soul does, his soul work, is that he helps kids in the township of Khayelitsha in South Africa to move through Gum movement, which is a niche form of African electronic dance music, but to move from a state of believing that there'll never be anything more than their current circumstances predict, to believing, in Stone's words, that they can find their own superpowers and be whoever they want to be. And I thought, well, scrap the music video. This is so much more interesting. And did a quick pivot and, landed up shooting Stone's story. And I just leaped on it because I thought that while this dance group was on the fringe of, in southern tip of Africa and in this township, and the music is a kind of a niche genre, but his message and his method really struck a nerve. I found it so universal, and I thought it can really inspire and uplift anyone all over the world. So that's why I just ran with it.
Yeah, I had the biggest smile on my face when I finished watching the film. It just brought me so much joy.
Thank you.
And then Lydia, the same thing happened to me when I watched Yves and Variation. I'd love to hear a little bit about finding him and discovering all that he does. He wears so many hats.
Yeah, Eve and I actually met on the subway in New York, very New York story. And we actually initially connected over both being classical violinists and sort of growing up in that world and having a love of music, but sort of at the same time having very separate careers, and sort of the challenge of trying to integrate music into a life that might not, where that's not sort of our primary profession. And so I quickly learned that Yves' life was full of many different roles, and he was not only a violinist, but also, as you say, just wore so many hats, including being a father, an art dealer, a concierge, a philanthropist, and sort of the variety of roles that Yves was able to manage to take on was really inspiring to me, and I really wanted to then continue to work with him and make a film that sort of imitated the way that I found out all of these things, which is sort of like, how is this all true? How can all of these things exist in one person? And so the observational storytelling style without sort of narration or interview or text to really explain what was going on became like a pretty important foundation for our making the film together, and sort of relying on sort of what information we can tell visually to sort of share someone's life.
It's a perfect segue to my next question. What I love about documentaries is that some filmmakers go in with the clearest vision of what they're going to make. They have their shot list, they have their script, if you will, and then they just shoot it, they edit it, and it's done. And other filmmakers, it takes a process of discovery as you're filming and editing to kind of figure out where exactly the story is headed. So I'd love to hear from all of you just kind of how that process really planned out. So I'm going to come back to you, Jesse. And you talked about listening to this podcast and learning about some of these people. Did you go in knowing exactly who you were going to interview? I know you talked a little bit about as well, really letting the viewer decide how they feel about this more controversial issue. But how did you kind of step back and let the story run its course?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That for me, I'm definitely more on the side of I just sort of go in there without a storyboard or a total game plan. But I initially had made contact with Lynn, the principal biologist, and I knew that I was going to be interviewing him, and we were going to be following one of his field study courses that goes on. So as far as I knew, I would at least be filming this course and interviewing the people in the course and interviewing the people that worked there with the bears. And then as far as I just sort of went to Minnesota, or the Northwoods of Minnesota, which, it's almost in Canada, it's pretty remote, and not ever having been to Minnesota before, not really knowing what to expect. But yeah, we filmed that course and did those interviews. And initially I had looked into filming with some people who live in that community who, don't support this feeding of bears. And that was something initially I thought maybe we could kind of show these people who live there and the people that come to do this field study course who love the bears, love feeding the bears, and then also show that other side. And we did reach out to some people, but they weren't interested in being a part of the film. And so that was sort of we had to pivot there and just say, all right, well, let's see, we can show what's going on here and, try to be as objective as possible, just to let the viewer decide in that way. But yeah, initially I had thought, maybe we try to do it almost even sided, where you'd spend some time at this field study course with the bears, and then hearing the other side, even interviewing other bear biologists and hearing that side of it. But yeah, at the end of the day, just based on multiple factors, it just seemed better to let this speak for itself rather than doing a documentary where you're really analyzing like the topic, and rather like let the footage speak for itself in that way, and let the viewer decide how they feel.
Yeah, definitely. Kate, your film takes such an interesting form with all of this archival footage. You have an actress coming in and reading as the role of Dora, and then you have Freud's voiceover reading his case study notes as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit about getting that structure laid out and figuring out, I'm sure there were thousands of other clips that you could have included in there, and so much more that could have been read and put on the screen. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how that all came together.
Yeah, so Dora, whose real name was Ida Bauer, there's a couple of photographs of her that we found, but there's no footage of her. There's no, she's from the 1900s. And so the question was, how do we bring this young woman to life on screen? We had great home movies of Freud. We have his case history that, I sort of took a pretty intricate case history and adapted for the screen, but pretty verbatim to his case. So we ended up casting an actor, as you say, to play Dora, and to try to present her and I created a script drawn partly from Freud's case history, in which he quotes her, although that's of course from his memory and his point of view, and then also from a lot of historical research that I did. For example, Freud gets her age wrong, and he always says she's a year older than she actually was. But I really wanted to create Dora as a character who was sort of spanned time periods. So even though the real Dora lived in 1900, the film is trying to sort of posit that this girl is in many ways still alive in the culture, and the messages that Dora received in 1900 are still alive and well in 2020. So I sort of started by going through Freud's case history and trying to distill it, really to the essentials, and to piece together just all the research that I had on this young woman. And then I also we went back and forth a lot on this in the edit, but made a decision to make it transparent that Dora was being played by an actor. So that's why you see her in the beginning of the film, you see her getting her makeup done. So really there's a sort of subtext to the film, or a subplot, which is this young actor in New York City in 2020 doing her first professional film gig, trying to bring justice to a character to whom she relates a lot. So that's why that sort of is there in the beginning, and it kind of frames the film. In terms of the clips that were used, that was, as you say, really difficult. It's a 13-minute film, and I think there's 250 separate pieces of media in the film. But I really was determined to have no sort of talking heads in the film, and to use clips from cinema, images from fine arts, from congressional hearings, whether Christine Blasey Ford or Anita Hill, to really use those clips as almost artifacts to sort of create this landscape in which it was undeniable that Freud's messages, which if you read them in a vacuum in the case history, sound so old-fashioned, it becomes hard to deny that okay, they might seem old-fashioned, but look, here they are. And in doing that, the only sort of talking head on screen is Dora. And she's the person who's really then placed at the center of the story, and not kind of drowned out by all of these voices. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Julia, with My Father the Mover, it's such a mix of all of these beautiful shots of this group dancing. You have a couple talking head interviews, you have voiceover. And I noticed there were a lot, and I'm sure it's because, with kids, it's kind of hard to get them to relax and open up with the camera right in their face, of their just profile shots of them talking about dance. So I'd love to hear a little bit about working with all these kids and constructing the narrative you have in the form that it took.
I just love working with kids because I find that their responses and they're unfiltered. As adults, we manicure and we filter, and our super egos are watching everything that we say, but kids don't do that. And what you get is a very real, authentic outcome. So I loved working with them, and I found the responses to be very honest. What was interesting about this film is that I had no intention to tell it through the lens of Stone's daughter's eyes. My intention was to show up at his house, film him in his house, go to a dance class and see his methodology, roll credits, lovely film. When we got to his house, Alata, his daughter, was there. And I said to Stone, "Who's this?" And he said, "This is my daughter, Alata." And I said, "Oh, great. Does she dance?" And he said, "No, she doesn't dance." And so I said, "Why doesn't she dance?" And it became apparent that, she was blocked in some or other regard. And immediately I thought, here's a way to make this story go much deeper, whereby we learn about Stone, we learn about his dance classes, but the drama resides in, okay, he works magic with these kids in the township. Can he put his own daughter through the program and get the same outcome? And so it was there and then on the shoot where we integrated that storyline and decided that we would go, and here you talk about blurring the lines between just, some kind of manufacturing on some part. We did create that he would go now with Alata, his daughter, to that beautiful place where they would try the dance. But that it was a very organic thing that came about through the actual storytelling, and it was a wonderful. It was very natural, and I think it's a fascinating case study on the medium, because on that day, the subject and the director, myself, we kind of cohabited the story coming into life, and I think that a lot goes to say about that in this medium, where you don't want to plan too much. You want to leave room for magic to happen, because this dynamic and this relationship brought the magic.
Yeah, and I loved seeing that she is dancing now at the end of the film as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then with Lydia, we'd already talked a little bit about meeting Eve and going and letting the film just kind of keep revealing more and more about him. So I'd love to hear a little bit about editing, because I'd imagine you have tons and tons and tons of footage with all that he does. So can you talk a little bit about deciding, because this isn't a very long film either, so just your process of getting it through post and figuring out, which parts you want to highlight, and cutting down on you'd filmed?
Yeah, so in some ways I had the roadmap that was Eve's life and all that he does and takes on, but I didn't really have sort of the scenes by which we understand those roles. And so a lot of the edit was really about finding ways to juxtapose components of his identity and his life, but also sort of reveal information in a way that did not necessarily fit a 3-act structure or sort of a narrative that's easy to digest, because I feel that so often people's lives do not fit into that mold, and people sort of defy a certain expectation of being having X career or X identity. There's multiple intersections of all of those things, and so I wanted the edit to in some ways imitate the way that Eve is so many different things at once, and wanted each reveal to be able to, and each reveal into a new scene, be able to share new information visually, and eventually create a sort of cycle back and return to certain components of his life.
I particularly loved, there's like a few snippets where in each clip he's just speaking another language, and it's like, of course he speaks French and this and that, and just can flow seamlessly in and out of one to the other.
Yeah, those were magical moments.
That's good. Well, I want to congratulate you all again on such amazing, amazing films, and thank you for sharing them with us and for being here with us today to talk about them. We have so much more content on our virtual cinema, so check it out, and we hope to see you back here soon. Thanks.